Why don't we open up to the Gospel of John, chapter 1. While we're turning there, did you know that the oldest piece of parchment that has been found, and it's a piece of parchment that's the size of like a credit card. The oldest one found in the entire New Testament is of the book of John. In fact, that's what this picture is of here. And it's specifically a little section of chapter 18 of when Jesus is standing before Pilate and that whole thing there. But here's what's even more fascinating. So they've dated that little piece of parchment. And of course, nothing's exact, but experts believe that that piece of parchment could be as early as about 120 AD. And if that's true, we know that John did most of his writings in the 90s, 80s, 90s, and possibly the Gospel of John, the Gospel that we are in, possibly as late as like 95 AD, which would put that parchment quite possibly within one generation of copy from John's original letter. Let me just read from verses 1 through 5 this morning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. Looked at last week, John is very clear in his very purpose for writing this gospel account, in which he writes in chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, he says, Jesus performed many other things than that are written in these pages, but these were written specifically so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that in believing you may have life in his name. It's not often that we have a portion of Scripture that tells us why it exists, but John is very clear. This is why I wrote this. When we open up the pages of the Gospel of John, if we don't believe, then there's nothing in John's account that will have any benefit to us. It will have no benefit to our spiritual life, to our relationship with God, to our ability to apprehend and understand spiritual things, eternal things, if we don't believe. Everything that John wrote in his gospel account, every story he decided to include, every conversation he decided to record, every miracle, every teaching of Jesus, every event that took place had behind it one specific purpose: to bring those who do not yet believe into faith. And then you could ask, well, if that's the case, then why are we going through Gospel of John if we already believe? Well, because I believe the same words of inspired Scripture are not only meant to move the heart that does not yet believe into faith, but those of us who do believe, to help keep us believing. The picture that John gives us in chapter 15 is the vine and the branch. And just like the branch needs daily nourishment from the vine to stay alive, as we go through the pages of the Gospel of John and go word by word, sentence by sentence, it is to our nourishment, even if we've known the Lord a long time. Not only does it have the power to bring someone into new believing faith, it also has the power to keep us who are believers deeply entrenched in our faith and continuing to grow in our faith. Faith is not a stagnant thing. It's not a passive position. It is a living, breathing thing that either dies, gets stagnant, or continues to grow and continues to deepen. And so the privilege we have of going through this book, and I'm so excited, is to keep you and I growing in our faith. And once again, John's gospel, the words are simple. He doesn't use a lot of big terms, big words. In fact, in the Greek, it's one of the simpler forms of Greek found in the New Testament. Yet, what he describes are such profound, deep theological truths that it just, there's so much there for us to mine and to discover the depth of. Let me ask you this. And we kind of touched on this last week. We could take John's gospel, we looked at his thesis statement that we just mentioned. I've written these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and then in believing you may have life in his name. That's the purpose he wrote his gospel account. If we reduced his entire gospel down to one word, we could reduce it down to this: believing. Believing. The key to everything that he has to say. If believing is so important, it literally is a matter of life. As John will say at the end of the 3rd chapter, he will say, those who believe have eternal life, but those who do not believe have rejected Christ, and the wrath of God is abiding on their life. John 3:36. That tells you right there that the matter of belief is a matter of life and death. It's of the most serious matter. And if that's the case, if that's true, then as we go through John, I think it's only logical that we should determine to understand what John means by believing. As you and I know very well, words can be co-opted. In our culture, there are many words that used to mean one thing and now mean something else. Words can sometimes be diluted. Sometimes they can just right out be redefined. You know, when I think of diluting something, think of taking like your favorite soda, root beer, Dr. Pepper, and taking a cup of it and pouring it into a gallon of water and then drinking it. There'd probably be no discernible taste of your favorite soda. It would be so diluted, it would just no longer have the same properties. That happens with words in our vocabulary, in our language, in our culture. Other times, words can be outright just redefined. The meaning of how it's used is so different from what it originally meant that it no longer has any reference point of those things. They look the same. You see it written out on a page. It sounds the same when you say the word, but it doesn't mean the same thing. One example is the word love. The word love has been, in a great sense, co-opted in our culture. It's been redefined. It's been watered down. And there's actually, I believe, a very sinister purpose behind redefining of terms and redefining of words and definitions, in co-opting certain words, changing what they actually mean in order to bring people about from one belief system, one value system, and getting them slowly to agree to another belief system, another value system, to change their ideology through the power of language and words that are used as propaganda to create ideas. And when we're not discerning and not aware of this, we can feel coerced into agreeing with something that we actually know is wrong because the way that words are being used. Love is a great example of that. The popular slogan, of course, we're all familiar with is love is love. And we know that if love is love, then love is no longer love. You will hear, especially now that we're in this political cycle, the election's coming up, you will hear politicians and leaders and other people say this: I believe that everybody should have the freedom to love who they want to love. When they say that, they've changed the definition of love. Love in that context is no longer a benevolence. It's no longer a way of sacrificing oneself to benefit another, which is really the meaning of love. It's now, love is a co-opted word that actually means your desire, your lustful cravings. In fact, really what they're saying is, I believe in the people's freedom to lustfully pursue and selfishly satisfy every impulse and desire that enters into my brain or my heart without any guardrails, without guidelines, without consequences. That's literally what they're saying. They don't realize that's what they're saying. But by co-opting the word love and taking it from the definition that God has given us in 1 Corinthians 13:6, it says, love doesn't serve itself. Love does no harm. Love does not rejoice in what is evil. The Bible describes love as something that's a giving to someone else for their benefit, not something that I'm taking from others to satisfy my own desires. That's not love. So put guardrails on myself right now so we don't spend the rest of the morning talking about that. But when you see how love is described in 1 Corinthians, that it's not self-seeking, it doesn't delight in evil, it doesn't dishonor others, that love looks nothing like the love they're talking about when they say love is love, and we should have the freedom to love however we want to love. The word belief may have been diluted and co-opted in some ways. And it's important for us to be diligent and really think through, what does it mean to believe? There's a lot of believing today, a lot of the way the word is used, and I'm speaking of not just non-Christian, but also within the church, where belief it doesn't carry much weight as far as what's connected with belief. In other words, belief doesn't cost you anything. Belief is actually void of implication that would dictate action, values, lifestyle. That's not how the Bible describes belief. And so I want us we're going to look at real briefly what it means to believe, and then where John says we are to place our belief and what we're to place our belief in. And so belief that's void of any adherence to commitment, when we say that we believe something that has no commitment to it, is not the believing that John describes. That's not what he means by believing. Just like love no longer means sacrifice, belief no longer means conviction and commitment to the thing that we say that we believe. A belief that has no impact, that requires no conformity to values or actions, is simply a belief that has no resemblance to what John talked about, what the New Testament talks about when it says believe. What does believe mean? I will try and wrap this in a little bit of an illustration here, but think of when we're in school, we're being taught, for instance, things about history or different subjects, and we believe those things. We accept those as facts that we're being taught. In a sense, we are believing, but in that sense, there's no real personal attachment that we have to those things we're being taught. They don't change my life. I learn about George Washington. Oh, it might be interesting, but I'm going through school. That's not changing my life. But I'm acquiring knowledge. I'm acquiring things that I believe are fact. Now, the Greek word here in the New Testament for believing, in which, by the way, 250 times in the verb form in the New Testament it's used, 100 of those 250 times it's used in the Gospel of John. That's why John is like believing, believing, believing. That's why I think it's so important for us to get to the heart of what does he mean by believing. So the Greek word there is pisteuo. The word literally means to entrust yourself, to trust in. And it comes from a root word that means to be persuaded to entrust yourself or to trust in. And that gives us a really big clue here about what biblical believing is all about. It's not a detachment of a fact. There's literally a personal effect that it has upon you when you believe. It's not a passive position. It's an active posture of entrusting oneself to that which you say you believe. Let me give you an illustration. There's in China, there is a footbridge. Its claim to fame is it's the highest footbridge in the world, at least as of 2016 when they finished building it. The name of the bridge, and I know I'll cut this one up, but Changchejai, take that one to the bank. But here's the thing about this. It is a footbridge whose bottom is made of glass. It's transparent. It spans over 1,400 feet, and it hovers over the valley at the greatest height of 980 feet. I hate height. And there's lots of people where they have pictures of people trying to cross this, and they're on their hands and knees because It looks like there's nothing below them. Here's the thing about that bridge. You can read articles about it. You can see pictures of it. You can hear testimonials of people who've crossed that bridge. You can educate yourself on all the engineering facts of how they accomplished building that bridge. And all those things may lead you to the conclusion that in theory, I could cross that bridge and be saved. That's a possibility. You could be convinced of just looking at the data, reading stories. But as we know, if you were hiking in those mountains and came across the beginning of that bridge, that platform, and you're looking down at a 1,000-foot drop, to step foot on that bridge and to cross it is a whole different thing than being intellectually convinced that, yeah, I think in theory that thing could hold me up. But would I step out on it and actually entrust my life, my well-being, everything that I hold dear to walking out on that footbridge? I think there's something in that tells us a little bit about what John meant about believing. See, when we open up the Gospel of John, John is going to begin to tell us the things that we should place our faith in, the realities of who the real Jesus actually is, the true place for us to place our belief. And we can read, we can do our own research by doing our own Bible study of the Gospel of John. We can look at the New Testament and we can see eyewitness accounts. John was an eyewitness of these things. As we remember, he begins his first epistle describing Jesus to the church. He says, this which we have seen with our eyes, which we have touched with our hands, the word of life, describing Jesus. John was an eyewitness to all the events that happened. John was an eyewitness of Jesus hanging on the cross. In fact, John is the one that Jesus said, would you take care of my mom as Christ is dying on the cross? John is an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus. John is an eyewitness to all these things. So we can read his account of these things. We can also do, you ever do like a Yelp, look at Yelp reviews of a restaurant? Well, we can look at 2,000 years of Christian history and get Yelp reviews of believers, men and women who've gone before us and who chose to trust Christ and see the outcome of their life. And they are now enjoying their reward in glory. See, we can take all that in, but we're still sitting on our couch or our chairs and still no risk to us. But biblical belief doesn't actually happen until we step out and trust what we say we believe. There is a personal attaching of ourselves to what we believe is true. And in this case, what we believe to be true about Jesus. Where we are willing to put the full weight of our trust, our eternal well-being into the hands of the testimony of who Jesus says that he is. That's when biblical believing actually happens in our life. Our confidence, our trust. It's literally to attach ourselves to Jesus. That's what happens when we begin to believe. We're attaching ourselves to him personally. Again, what did John say? These things were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That you would personally attach your trust, your confidence. You're all in banking everything that Jesus is true. And in that, you will have life in his name. I think that's a really, maybe an oversimplification, but an important reality for us to kind of get down in us as we continue to read all the places where John says, believe, believe, believe. What does he mean by believe? He means entrusting ourselves. He means giving ourselves over entrusting attachment to the person of Jesus Christ. So, as we open up now to chapter 1, verse 1, John's going to begin to tell us where to place this belief, what it is that we are to believe, where it is that we're to place this trust. And he begins in the beginning. Now, in the very first 3 words of his entire gospel, he's grabbing the attention of every Jewish reader that's listening and hearing and reading his gospel account. In the beginning. As a Jew, they would have immediately recognized that his gospel is beginning with the same first 3 words of the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. John is going to begin to convince us and describe for us why Jesus is God. And he's going to begin with the first 3 words, in the beginning. He's saying that Jesus has always existed. This Jesus of Nazareth didn't begin his life at the birth given by Mary. He's always existed. Jesus is eternal. By Jesus' own witness, in his prayer to his Father in John 17:5, he says these words, Father, glorify me in your presence with your glory, the glory that I had with you before the world began. Wow. Jesus is saying by his own mouth, Father, I was with you before the beginning of the world, before in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you and I were together. So John begins with a bang. I mean, he's taking us, we're not wading into the shallow end of the pool. We are jumping in the deepest part of the pool going, in the beginning. In the beginning what? In the beginning was the Word. The second thing that John is saying that we are to believe, where we are to put our trust, what we are to entrust ourselves in, is not only has Jesus always existed, but he is the eternal living Logos, which is simply the ancient Greek word that is used here for word. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And he was with God from the beginning. Now, to you and I, that's kind of foreign to our ears. It's kind of like, he's the Word. It's kind of strange to us to consider comparing Jesus to what seems like an inanimate object. But listen, to both the Jews and to the Greeks of his time, that word would have had great, rich, and deep meaning to both cultures. We said before that John's gospel was written for the whole world. Maybe that's why the Gospel of John is usually the first thing we want to hand someone who's seeking truth or we're witnessing to, or to a young Christian, because of what John has to say is so encompassing. Matthew's gospel written primarily to the Jews to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. Mark was written to the Romans. Luke was written to the Greeks. John's gospel is written for everyone, for the entire world. And here in this very first sentence, he is going to reach out to the two primary cultures of his time, the Jews and the Greeks, and he's going to meet them both in a place that they would have understood, that would have had something of a foothold for them to grab a hold of what John is trying to say. The word logos, the word that means word, means speech, it has kind of a complex meaning. But to the Jew, it represented primarily revelation. The Jew would have seen logos as God's revelation of himself. In the beginning was the Word. In fact, there are many instances where they refer directly to God as the Word of God. So what Paul was saying, or what John was saying to the Jews reading this is, Jesus is that Logos. Jesus is the revelation of God. As we read later on in verse 14 of the same chapter, John 1:14, the Word, the Logos, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So to the Jews, John is saying, Jesus is God's revelation of himself. Hebrews 1, chapter 1, verse 1 begins this way. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days has spoken to us by his Son. God is expressing himself. The invisible God of all eternity is now making himself known and visible and expressing himself through his Son that could be touched, could be seen, was made flesh and dwelt among us. Now, what about to the Greeks? What did Logos mean to the Greeks? To the Greco-Roman culture and mindset when they would have heard this word? Well, Logos primarily meant to the Greeks, to the Greek philosophers, something of power. Power in the sense of control. That power which controls the world from chaos, which keeps the world in order, was defined as ultimate reason. So to the Jew, Logos meant revelation of God. To the Greek, it meant ultimate reason. The word Logos, reason for things, the reason behind life. The rhyme and reason why things work and why things are in order, why the world spins around, why there's a law of gravity, why there are certain things that if you do will always happen. There's a reason, there's a design behind life that the Greeks believed. Even though they believed in multiple gods, they believed that there was a overarching order and reason for everything. And to the Greeks, John is saying, Jesus is that reason. Jesus is the power that keeps everything in order. Colossians 1:17, he is before all things, and in all things, and in him all things hold together. Hebrews 1:3, speaking of Jesus, he sustains all things by the power of his word. So, when we read these words, in the beginning was the Word. As we kind of delve into how they would have heard these words when John wrote them, there's a whole lot there to unpack and to understand how powerful this statement is. Here's a connected picture that we have. Do you remember in Acts 17? Paul is in Athens, and he sees all these shrines to all these gods that they're all worshiping. And he begins to engage the Stoic philosophers, the Epicurean philosophers, and they begin to debate Paul. And one of the things that Paul says, he says, all these things that you give yourself to, all these gods that you worship, all these philosophies you all day long just love to banter about and to argue with each other and debate these ideologies, all these things you give yourself to, God is not in them. The God who made the heavens and the earth is not in these things. And then he begins to point to Jesus. And he says these words. He says, for in him, Jesus, we live and move and have our being. So Paul was saying to these Greek philosophers, that great control, that great power that's behind all these things in the world that you love to debate about and come up with all kinds of philosophies about, let me tell you actually who that is. That's Jesus. He is the reason. He is the one that holds all things together. He's the reason why the universe continues as it is. Words are powerful. Through words, God created the heavens and the earth. By words, God reveals who he is. Jesus is that logo. And it's almost as if John is saying, listen, to both Jews and Greeks, listen, for centuries, you've been talking, you've been thinking and writing about the Logos. But I want to tell you who this Logos actually is. And John is meeting his world, his generation, where they were at, explaining who Jesus was in the context of something they could get a hold of, something that they were already pondering, something that they were already considering as of God. And John is saying, let me tell you who this person is. It's Jesus. To the Jews, this is God. To the Greeks, this is the power. This is the reason behind all of life. Just remember, John is an eyewitness to this life, this word of life. So, third thing that John is now going to say that we should believe in, where we should place our trust. We place our belief that Jesus is eternal. We place our belief that Jesus is the Logos. And now he's going to ask us to believe that Jesus is the Creator. Verse 3, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that was made. You can imagine Jews again reading this. And it's almost like John saying, hey, remember Genesis 1:1? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Guess what? That was Jesus co-creating with God the Father. Do you remember in Genesis when God said, let there be light? That was Jesus with the Father. Do you remember when God created the plants and the trees, when he separated the land from the water? That was Jesus co-creating with the Father. When God created the plants and the trees, seed-bearing plants to bear in like kind, that was Jesus co-creating with the Father. When God created the oceans to be teeming with living creatures, the land to be teeming with animals, the skies to be teeming with birds, that was Jesus co-creating with the Father. Colossians 1:17. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So first, John is just not wasting any time in this gospel. We are a few sentences in, and he's already saying, hey, guess what, guys? Let's get to the point right away. Jesus is God. We talked a little bit about last week about how the fact that there's 4 gospels, and in those 4 gospels we get 4 different profiles or portraits of who Jesus is. And how when you look at them as a whole, they don't contradict each other, but they complement each other. Because they all provide immense contributions to what we understand to be true about Jesus, about God, about his plan, about why Jesus came. And we know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic gospels. The word synoptic just simply means to see something together, grouped together. And we know Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of have a similar form in which they present Jesus' ministry, his death, and his resurrection. And you could say in a very simplistic way that they really focus more upon what Jesus taught and Jesus' ministry, what he did and what he taught. But John's primary focus is on who Jesus is. We have more direct, clear, unambiguous statements about who Jesus is, his true nature, his true person in the Gospel of John. And keep in mind, as we move through the Gospel of John, he almost builds his entire gospel around two different things. He builds it around 7 signs that we will track through his gospel. 7 signs, and all those signs were miracles that he performed that had a bigger purpose for than just meeting personal needs of the people who were being healed or experiencing the miracle power of God. They were all meant to be a sign pointing them to Jesus of who he was, who this person is in their midst. He cast out a demon, yes, to alleviate the suffering of this person who was bound by a demon. But it was also, this miracle was a sign. Signs point to something. Signs are not the substance in themselves. They point you to the substance. They were signs pointing to who this is. And so we see that. We'll see that throughout this gospel account of 7 different signs that John, we already read, John said, hey, Jesus did a lot of stuff. And I'm not even putting in this book. But these things I picked out because they continue to underline the very purpose I'm writing to you, so that you would know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. The other thing that he builds his gospel around is the 7 I am state of Jesus. Of course, this goes back to Exodus chapter 3, when God is raising up Moses to send him to be the deliverer of his people. And Moses says, well, who do I say sent me? And he says, I am. Hayah. Tell them Hayah sent you. That became the personal revelation of how God named himself in the Old Testament. The children of Israel who were suffering under the whips of oppression and slavery did not need to be convinced that God existed. They knew God existed. What they needed to know is that God heard their suffering and that God was present. God says to Moses, tell them, I am that I am. I am here. I am here. And Jesus intentionally, purposefully, clearly grabs that Hayah of Exodus chapter 3 and applies it to himself 7 times. I am Hayah. I am the bread of life. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the true vine. Are we getting the whole picture here of John's gospel? It's accentuated. It's like this big neon light of something that when we first hear it, even Christians struggle with it. Yeah, I know Jesus died for my sins and he was the Son of God, but oh God, that Jesus is God? That's why. Listen, that's why Jesus of the Gospel of John is not the same Jesus of the Jehovah's Witness. The Jesus of the Jehovah's Witness is Michael the Archangel, just another part of God's creation. The Jesus of Jehovah's Witness is not God. The Jesus of the Gospel of John is not the Jesus of Mormonism. The Jesus of Mormonism is Satan's spirit brother. The Jesus of Mormonism is an exalted man who, through the law of eternal progression, was exalted to the position of a God, small g. So the Jesus that Mormons tell you about is not the same Jesus. The Jesus of Christian Scientists is not the same Jesus of the Gospel of John. The Jesus of Christian Scientists was a man, and the Messiah, the Christ, was an ideology that he embraced, but he was not God. The Jesus of the Gospel of John is not the same Jesus that you find referred to in Eastern religions. That Jesus was an enlightened guru. Jesus of the Gospel of John is not the same Jesus of Islam, a prophet and a teacher, but he was not the Son of God. My point is this: the Gospel of John makes it all about who Jesus was, that he was God. The entire New Testament is resting on this truth of who Jesus actually was. The entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation is pointing to this Jesus. And if you get Jesus wrong, it's all wrong. If you get Jesus wrong, it all begins to come apart. Why? Well, because then you don't believe the testimony of the Gospel of John. For only God has existed from all eternity. Only God can create the heavens and the earth.